name is James Davies and welcome to Photo Chat Vlog on YouTube. In the last episode I talked about intentional double exposures on film, where a camera film is exposed twice by different people in different places for artistic purposes. If you haven't watched that episode yet, it has a little animation that explains how double exposing film works, and if you're curious about the process you might want to check that out. What I want to talk about today is unintentional or accidental double exposures, where a film which somebody else had already used was double exposed, by accident, by me. We'll look at some of the things that happened as a result of the accident in a moment, but first I want to explain how I ended up doing all of this. So I've taken photos on and off for much of my life, starting as a kid when I got my first Kodak Instamatic camera. I moved on to borrowing my brother's SLR, and I learned how to develop my own films and photos in my late teens, and I then actually pursued it as part of my art school days in my early 20s. But I guess my current passion for photography stems from the early part of this century, when I discovered the resurgence in popularity of film photography via movements like lomography. I'd never given up on film, but I'd been reluctant to do any big spending on any digital gear, knowing how fast things were moving. And when I saw what people out there were doing by taking photos on old cameras with old film, I wanted to try it. The move over to digital meant a happy coincidence of old photography gear being sold off in abundance, and eBay, charity shops and car boot sales meant that I acquired a lot of gear and I took a lot of photos. The new place to show photos, of course, was the internet, and things kicked off for me on LiveJournal with various photography communities. But I found my real home when I signed up for Flickr in 2005. So I soon became enthusiastic about buying old film as well as old cameras, and one of the charity shop chains in my hometown makes a point of keeping all the cameras that are brought in. They store them until they go out to one of the city branches for a photography promotion, usually every quarter. So you get to visit one of the shops, and the window and a fair bit of the shop will be full of cameras. I bought some of my favourites from here. My Agfa Clack, a Yashica 35, both of my Olympus Mu 2s, and a whole lot more. But there are often lots of boxes of camera accessories too, like lens hoods, cable releases, cases and tripod parts, and in there you can often find film. Now, part of the lomography school of thought was to shoot old expired film to make use of the strange colours and grain that you get when the emulsions go past their sell-by date. Getting hold of old film was always a challenge for me, because high street shops didn't really want to sell it, and things can get expensive on eBay. But the charity shop route was a really good way to get hold of it for a good price. Some of it was obviously old film because it was made by companies who had stopped producing it. Some was still in the box with a date on it, and some was obviously pretty new but just in the canister. So buying any of it was going to be a potluck thing. But as any film photographer knows, there's a certain thrill to bagging an interesting stash of film. So over the years I bought and I used a lot of film in this way, and I got some interesting results, especially with things like pinhole photography and cross-processing slide film and so on. So when my sister gave me an untested Olympus OM10 for my birthday back in 2013, I wanted to check it out, and I reached for a film from my stash. There was, after all, no point in trying expensive Kodak Ektar 100 in something that might not even work. Now the roll I chose seemed like a good all-rounder. I think it was Fuji 400 ASA colour film, and I ran it through the camera over the summer of 2013, taking a bunch of shots in my garden and some out in the park with friends. Now I tend to save up films until I get around 4 or 5 before I get them developed and scanned, so it'd been a while since I shot the film before I saw it. When I got the scans and little contact sheets back, I was a bit confused, because there didn't seem to be a test roll from an SLR amongst the results, and there also seemed to be a double set in there. It actually took a while before I realised what had happened, and that was that the roll of film I'd put through the Olympus OM10 was not only expired, but it had been used by somebody else already. Somebody totally random, some of whose camera stuff had obviously been donated to charity at some point, and the film ended up being bought by me. Now you can find a link to all the photos from this roll on my blog, down in the video description, since I wrote an article about this a few years ago. But what we can see here is a montage of all of the shots, and I will go into detail with some of them later on. Now what I think happened is the film must have been shot first by this group of young people on a trip up a mountain. It looks like it's in the UK somewhere, based on there being a shot of cars that have got no UK number plates. And there's a UK road sign visible in this shot, albeit blasted out by the flash. From what I can see on the film, it looks like there are 4 guys and 1 girl. They also look like they're having a whale of a time. And since at one point they're on a train, there's a good chance that they were in Snowdonia in Wales. But in truth, only they are actually going to know where they were. Now, in using the film to test my camera, I unintentionally wrecked the record of their time up the mountain. But at the same time, the film was forgotten about, and it might never have got developed at all if I hadn't bought it. So when I see their record of their trip up the mountain, I do feel sad that I did end up taking photographs over the top of it. But at the same time, I bought the film in as good as faith you can in a charity shop, and given what happened, all that's left is to examine the outcome and see what we can make of it. So in this first image, we can see 3 people, 2 guys and the girl. I thought for a long time that they were inside somewhere, because the lighting of the guy holding his hand up looks like a flash indoors to me, and the white space around him could have been a white painted wall in a hostel or something. But in reality, they're outside, probably high up amongst overcast skies, and there is an outline of a peak in the bottom right hand corner. Now, just like the intentional double exposures, there's a huge element of chance to these images. In particular, I had no idea at all that the film was used. With a conscious doubles project, you at least know that your own images are going to wind up merged with somebody else's. But as far as I was concerned, I was just using this film to test my new camera. So I just loaded it into the camera any old way, and with the result that my images don't fit perfectly on top of the other ones. In fact, they seem to almost perfectly overlap in the centre of each other. And then, of course, the person who developed my films chose the mountain photographs over mine when it came to framing the scans. So again, as with the intentional double exposures, there is of course a third party influencing the images that you can see here. Moreover, one set of images are inverted, or perhaps more accurately, the mountain images are rotated 180 degrees from mine. So although no one meant the pictures to turn out this way, neither party taking them had any say in how they did eventually reveal themselves, not even that it was a double exposure project. So the results are truly unintentional. Now what I love about this photo is how on the left hand side, my upside down kitchen window creates a frame that fits around the guy who's wearing a hat. My house had been burgled earlier that week, and my kitchen window had been smashed and it was boarded up in the middle, leaving just a little sliver of light around it. I think the way that it sits around the guy's head is really cool. Half of the other guy's shirt also turned into leaves, because the right hand frame that I shot was taken in the University Parks in Oxford, and his dark shirt had evidently left loads of unexposed photographic emulsion on the film. Now as you scan right from him, you can just see a few of my mates floating upside down in the sky. Overall, it's not a great image of my kitchen, it's not a great image of the park, and the mountaineers have been thrust into some sort of psychedelic moment. But I have to say I kind of like the results. Now in the next image there is a lot going on. Starting at the left you can see the legs of 2 people sitting on a crimson blanket, and one of them is actually me. And since that photo was shot in portrait mode, we're actually sideways rather than upside down. Then we see 2 mountaineers in the distance before we get to the black line between the frames. To the right of that, things are a bit confusing. There is grass in the sky. Remember that the 2 sets of photographs are aligned 180 degrees from each other. And you can just about see a chap looking back at the camera. A distant hill is also visible behind him, but there are also lots of leaves and 2 upside down little girls. I think it's very easy here to see how our eyes are struggling to make any sense of this because of the confusing arrangement of all the elements that are present. There are things at opposing angles, the scales of all the images are at odds with each other, and lots of shapes are overlapping and interfering with each other. So what is interesting therefore is if we rotate the image so that the mountaineers are upside down. Suddenly to me, Now the left-hand image becomes much more noticeable as Sunday afternoon in the park under the trees, because the grass is the right way up and the kids are no longer upside down, and it's clear that there are some grown-ups sitting on the grass. The legs have now been rotated over to the right-hand side, so they're still a bit odd-looking and sideways. But I also think too, it's now much harder to make sense of the three mountaineers, or even the landscape that they're in. Now, being perfectly honest, this image is a bit too busy for me, and if it hadn't been for it being an image that worked equally depending on which way around it was oriented, I wouldn't have paid it much attention. But I think it's very interesting how it illustrates how our minds perceive images and make sense of them. It would seem that we do require things we expect to be on the ground to be represented in that way in images, for example. Now, in the final image that I want to talk about today, we can see that our mountaineers look like they've got to the top, and it doesn't look like very good weather up there. Hats are on, and our friends are squinting, perhaps because of the sleet or the cold, and they seem to be blanketed in white clouds. Actually, I think in their image the only clouds are in the sky behind them, but because of the double exposure whiting out parts of the image, it looks like they might be in foggy mists, especially the girl on the left, who looks quite faded. But of course, it's not the clouds that are fading her, it's the expanse of light that got exposed onto the film by my double exposure. Now, I've looked hard, but I can't work out what I was actually taking a photograph of on the left-hand side of this frame. So things get really interesting as we pan to the right, where we can see that the guy with the glasses appears to be metamorphosing into a hairy, spiny porcupine-type figure. Of course, what has really happened is the interaction of his dark jumper with an upside-down image of some trees. Now, those trees are in fact in the front garden of my old house, and the flash of light that's obscuring the face of the chap on the right of him in the green t-shirt is actually the S1 double-decker bus, which passed by where I used to live on the way into Oxford. It's a real shame that this summit photograph has been wrecked by being accidentally double exposed with half of two other images. Yeah, the hairy porcupine thing is kind of fantastical looking, but it can't really make up for the loss of their special moment after all of the excursion of climbing up to the top. As I mentioned earlier, the only consolation there is results from the film being developed in the first place. If I hadn't bought it and used it as a test film, it may never have been seen by anybody and have been lost forevermore. So this is also a reminder, really, that for the people in the image, the record of their trip actually remains lost, since, as far as I can tell, they don't know about the fate of the film. I mean, I've never heard from them. I tried my best when I wrote the blog post to get the message out there about what happened to the film. And although I've heard from some other people who've seen these images and helped identify things, no one has actually come forward and said, "That's me." But nevertheless, I remain intrigued by many things about the original images that are in these photographs. The obvious questions are, who are the people? Where were they? And what year were they taken? One observation from the net was that it could have been the late 90s. And then there are other thoughts. Did they have a good trip? Are they still friends today? Do they want the film back? So, since this is the internet, maybe someone will recognise one or more of them and let them know what happened to the film. Add a comment if you've got anything to say about the pictures or if you know the people, and we'll kind of take it from there. It's a long shot, of course, but you never know. And so there we have some examples of accidental double exposures. As ever, if you like what you see, feel free to hit the like button or subscribe to the channel. If you have a comment, please go ahead and write one, and although I've already said it, if you were in that group of people who were up the mountain, or you know who they were, drop me a line. Meanwhile, I will see you in the next episode of Photo Chat Vlog.